What if everything we were told about man landing on the moon was a big hoax? What if the greatest achievement in human history had never happened? For decades, we have been taught to see the Apollo 11 mission as one of science's most glorious moments, a milestone that symbolized humanity's victory over the limits of the impossible. But what if this story was carefully fabricated? What if the images, the speeches, and even the moon rocks they showed us were nothing more than a masterful act designed to deceive the entire world? NASA maintains that in 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface, planting the United States flag and uttering the iconic phrase, "One small step for man, one giant leap for humanity." But there are those who say that this leap never happened. There is evidence, inconsistencies, and statements that suggest this mission may have been one of the greatest manipulations in modern history. And the burning question is, what would be the real reason for staging something so grand? To understand this, we need to go back in time and look at the context that surrounded this supposed historic feat. In the middle of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were fighting a silent battle for power and influence, and one of the main areas of dispute was the space race. The Soviet Union had already achieved impressive feats, such as launching the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, and sending the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. The pressure on the United States was immense. They needed to prove to the world that they were one step ahead, that their technology was superior, that they could go further than any other nation had ever gone. But what if, faced with technical difficulties and the threat of failure, the solution found was to create a perfect illusion? Many questions surround this story. Why did NASA lose the original Apollo 11 mission tapes? How is it possible that, to date, no other manned mission has returned to the moon even with technology advancing exponentially? Why do photos taken on the lunar surface feature inconsistent shadows, flags fluttering in an airless environment, and a strange absence of stars in the sky? These are small details that for many form a big puzzle, and when these pieces are analyzed together, doubt becomes inevitable. Now, before we go any further into this mystery and lay out the evidence that could prove this was the greatest act in history, I want to know what you think. Do you believe that NASA really put a man on the moon? Or do you think this story has too many flaws to be taken seriously? Comment right now. The hoax is falling apart. And let's continue unraveling this mystery. With each new piece of this puzzle, doubts increase. If the Apollo 11 mission was real, why are there so many inconsistencies that have not yet been explained convincingly? Why does NASA seem to avoid any deeper questioning of the matter, treating contrary evidence as simple conspiracy theories? And most importantly, if man's landing on the moon really happened, why have we never returned, even with decades of technological advances? Nothing about this story seems to fit together perfectly. The supposed lunar landing would have been broadcast live around the world, but the original videos simply disappeared. NASA's justification? They were erased and reused. How is it possible that one of the most important records in human history has been treated with such neglect? What about the moon rocks that were supposedly brought back from the mission? Some samples, when analyzed, turned out to be nothing more than earthly stones. So the question remains, are we facing a disastrous mistake or a carefully planned lie? And this brings us to another point that few stop to think about. The Cold War was not just a technological dispute, but also a war of narratives. The Soviet Union was ahead in the space race, and the United States desperately needed to change that story. What would be the best way to ensure that the world believed in American superiority? Put on a perfect show, something so grand that it would leave any competitor unresponsive. The problem is that when something is too big, too perfect, it starts to raise suspicions. So press like, because this discussion needs to reach more people. And if you haven't signed up yet, do so now, because what's to come will leave you even more intrigued. At the height of the Cold War, the world was divided between two superpowers that fought not only for territories and ideologies, but also for technological and scientific supremacy. The United States and the Soviet Union were fighting an invisible war, a battle where victory was not determined by direct confrontations, but by who would dominate the future. And one of the main areas of this dispute was space. Mastery of outer space meant more than just scientific advancement. It meant power, influence, and the ability to demonstrate too. The world, which system was superior? American capitalism or Soviet communism? the Soviet Union took the lead, shocking the world with historic feats, such as the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, and the sending of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. The United States was behind, and this disadvantage was not just a matter of wounded pride, it was a real threat to its global hegemony. It was in this context that President John F. Kennedy made one of the boldest speeches in history, declaring that the United States would land a man on the moon and bring him back safely before the end of the 1960s. But there was a big problem. At that time, Americans were far from having the technology necessary to fulfill that promise. NASA faced immense difficulties, not only technical but also budgetary. The development of the Apollo rockets was a monumental challenge, and each failed test put more pressure on the space agency. Time was ticking, the Soviet Union continued to advance, and the American government could not afford to fail. What if the only way to guarantee victory was to simulate this achievement? The idea of falsifying man's arrival on the moon may seem absurd at first glance, but when we analyze the situation at the time, it makes more sense than many imagine. The United States government knew that the country's credibility was at stake, and that a defeat in the space race could have devastating consequences. Furthermore, polls showed that public opinion was increasingly skeptical regarding the high investments in NASA, especially with the Vietnam War draining resources and the social crisis intensifying within American territory itself. Maintaining the support of the population was crucial, and there was nothing more efficient for this than an event that united the nation in a feeling of patriotism and triumph. The pressure on NASA was immense. Documents from the time show that engineers and scientists worked at a breakneck pace, trying to solve problems that seemed insoluble with the technology available in the 1960s. Many experts claim that, in fact, there was no way the Apollo 11 mission could have been successful with the resources and knowledge of the time. Rudimentary navigation systems, extremely limited computers, and a hostile environment that could easily turn any mistake into a disaster. Furthermore, there are those who question the very structure of the spacesuits worn by astronauts. How was it possible for them to withstand the extreme radiation of deep space without adequate protection? How could they have survived crossing the Van Allen belt, a highly radioactive zone around the Earth, without suffering lethal damage? And here comes the hypothesis that many believe to be the most plausible explanation. NASA realized that it would not be able to fulfill Kennedy's promise within the stipulated deadline, and instead of admitting defeat, it would have found another solution, a solution that would guarantee American victory in the space race without the real risks and challenges of a manned mission to the moon. Another point that reinforces the idea of a simulation is the behavior of the Apollo 11 astronauts after the mission. Instead of showing enthusiasm and pride, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins seemed strangely uncomfortable and evasive in interviews and public events. Armstrong's silence over the years, his reluctance to make statements about the mission, and the notable lack of enthusiasm in his rare public appearances led many to suspect that he was carrying a secret too heavy to reveal. Buzz Aldrin, on the other hand, had aggressive reactions whenever confronted with the idea that the mission was faked, even punching a skeptic who challenged him to swear on the Bible that he had actually been to the moon. And now I want to know your opinion. Do you believe the space race was a fair contest, or do you think the United States staged the landing of man on the moon to ensure its victory over the Soviet Union? Write in the comments what you think, and to test if you're really following everything, comment right now. NASA staged the whole thing. If the Apollo 11 mission really happened the way we were told, why are there so many inconsistencies in the official images released by NASA? The photographs and videos of the supposed landing on the moon should be definitive proof of this historic feat, but curiously, these records raise more questions than they answer. Experts, photographers, filmmakers, and even scientists have pointed out visual flaws and contradictions that suggest these images may have been created artificially, possibly in a recording studio, rather than on the lunar surface. What if the greatest achievement of space exploration was nothing more than an extremely well-planned film production? One of the most controversial details is the shadows cast on the lunar surface. Any light source in an environment without an atmosphere should produce parallel shadows, as the only light present on the moon would be that of the sun. However, many images from the Apollo 11 mission show shadows falling in different directions, as if there were multiple sources of lighting. This doesn't make sense if we are talking about a natural environment. In a real scenario on the moon, the shadows should be completely uniform with no unexplained variations. But what happens when we analyze the photographs? Slanted shadows, differently lit, objects and a visual pattern that much more closely resembles what we would expect to see on a spotlight-lit film set than in deep space. And there is one more detail that defies any logical explanation. In all official photos of the mission, there is not a single star visible in the lunar sky. Considering that the moon has no atmosphere to distort or obscure the light, one would expect the sky to be filled with bright stars, much more visible than from Earth. But what do we see? A completely dark background without a trace of stars. NASA's official explanation is that the camera's exposure was adjusted to capture surface lighting, and that is why the stars do not appear. But does this justification make sense? Several photographers and imaging experts argue that even with exposure adjustments, it would still be possible to capture at least some stars in the background. Their complete absence raises suspicions that the scenario may have been created artificially, and that the lack of stars was a deliberate decision to avoid errors in recreating the lunar sky. And then we have one of the most bizarre aspects of the filming, the American flag fluttering on the surface of the moon. How is this possible in an environment without an atmosphere? NASA tried to explain this phenomenon by stating that the flag had a horizontal rod at the top to keep it stretched, and that the observed movement was the result of the inertia caused by being planted in the ground. But if this explanation is correct, why does the flag continue to wave in some images, even after the astronauts have already moved away? This detail became one of the most questioned elements of the Apollo 11 mission, as it directly defies the laws of physics in an environment where there should be no wind, breeze, or any type of resistance to movement. These inconsistencies have led many researchers and theorists to question whether the lunar landing was, in fact, staged in a controlled environment. And this is where a name emerges strongly within this theory: Stanley Kubrick, the legendary filmmaker, responsible for 2001, A Space Odyssey, one of the most revolutionary films in the history of cinema, would have been the one chosen by the American government to direct the recording of the fake landing on the moon. This theory is based not only on Kubrick's cinematographic quality, which already demonstrated an advanced understanding of visual effects for the time, but also on supposed evidence left by the director himself in his later works. One of the most discussed points is that, shortly after the launch of 2001, A Space Odyssey, NASA would have turned to Kubrick to help create a convincing visual environment to simulate the Apollo 11 mission. This theory is strengthened when we analyze the techniques used in the film, which recreated with impressive precision the sensation of zero gravity, the lighting of space, and the movements of astronauts in extraterrestrial environments. If Kubrick was able to do this in a film, why couldn't he have done the same under orders from the American government? Another curious detail is found in The Shining, one of Kubrick's most enigmatic films. Many believe the film contains coded messages about the director's involvement in the lunar landing hoax. One of the most famous examples is the sweater worn by boy Danny, which features the inscription Apollo 11 USA with the image of a rocket. Additionally, there are several numerical and visual references that theorists suggest are clues left by Kubrick as a cry for help or a veiled acknowledgement of his participation in the cover-up. If this theory is true, Kubrick would have been forced to maintain absolute silence on the matter, perhaps under threat of reprisals from the government. There are those who say that his death in 1999 was surrounded by mystery, and that he may have been silenced to prevent him from revealing anything prematurely. Be that as it may, the fact is that this connection between NASA and Hollywood raises many suspicions, especially when we consider that the space agency itself has admitted to having used cinematographic techniques to train astronauts and simulate extraterrestrial environments. If the Apollo 11 mission was real, why has so much physical evidence disappeared or been surrounded by inexplicable mysteries? This is one of the most questionable points in this entire story. What should be the greatest achievement of space? Exploration, the feat that would forever change humanity's relationship with the universe, is full of flaws and gaps that, to this day, have not been properly clarified. One of the biggest absurdities is the disappearance of the original tapes of the Apollo 11 mission. How is it possible that one of the most important records in history has simply disappeared? NASA, the agency responsible for the mission, which invested billions of dollars in space technology, went public to say that the original recordings were erased or reused. That's right, reused. The official excuse is that due to a shortage of magnetic tapes at the time, some recordings from the Apollo mission were overwritten to save space. But does it make sense that authentic records of the first human landing on the moon have been treated with such neglect? We're talking about an event that redefined human history, and NASA wants us to believe that it didn't take the necessary precautions to preserve this material. This isn't just strange, it's unbelievable. The argument that at the time it was not thought that these recordings needed to be kept forever is not convincing, as even trivial government documents are archived for decades, let alone the footage of one of the most iconic moments in modern history. Now, I want to know what you think about all this. Do you believe that NASA really lost the Apollo 11 tapes due to carelessness, or was this a way to hide something? Write your opinion about this. Mystery in the comments, and to test if you're following everything, comment right now. The evidence has disappeared, but the doubts only increase. And then another even more intriguing question arises. If the moon landing was a success, and if the technology of the 1960s was capable of taking astronauts there, why have we never gone back? Why in more than 50 years has no other manned mission been sent to the moon? NASA's official response is that after the Apollo missions, the focus of space exploration changed, prioritizing the construction of the International Space Station and other research. But does this really make sense? With all the technological evolution of recent decades, with computers millions of times more powerful than those used on Apollo 11, why haven't we established a permanent lunar base yet? The idea that man went to the moon with primitive computers, rudimentary technology, and limited operating systems, but that today, with all the scientific advances, this would be unfeasible makes no sense. How is it possible that in 1969, we managed to land on the moon and return safely, but now, in the 21st century, we are still discussing the possibility of trying again? NASA promises a new manned mission to the moon in the coming years with the Artemis program, but why has it taken so long? If the feat of 1969 was so successful, why don't we repeat this process several times over the decades? One of the explanations put forward by skeptics and researchers is that, in fact, we never went to the moon, and that's exactly why we haven't been back. If the Apollo 11 mission was a hoax, it would be impossible to repeat this feat, as image recording, transmission, and analysis technologies are now infinitely superior to those of the time. Today, any inconsistent detail would be quickly identified by experts and the general public. In 1969, when NASA released images from the mission, people did not have the resources necessary to analyze the recordings accurately. Today, with artificial intelligence, advanced editing software, and thousands of independent scientists spread across the world, any attempt at staging would be easily unmasked. And there is another factor to consider: the Van Allen belt. This region of space filled with intense radiation should be a deadly barrier to any manned mission. The Apollo astronauts would have passed through this zone without suffering significant damage, something that many scientists question. To this day, today space engineers talk about the need to develop advanced radiation protection for future manned missions beyond Earth orbit. But if NASA was able to do this in 1969, why is it still a problem today? These are just some of the many questions that remain without satisfactory answers. NASA, rather than encouraging investigations and providing incontrovertible proof of its missions, seems to care more about discrediting those who ask questions. If there is nothing to hide, why so? Many inconsistencies. Why are there so many lost pieces of evidence, so many flaws in documentation, and so many excuses that don't make sense? And before moving on to the next revelations, press like now, because this content needs to reach more people. If you haven't signed up yet, do so now, because we're just beginning to unlock NASA's biggest secrets. If the Apollo 11 mission really happened the way NASA claims, why have the astronauts involved in the supposed lunar landing themselves acted so strangely over the years? However, what we see are uncomfortable reactions, averted looks, vague responses, and in many cases, complete silence on the subject. Why did Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins seem to avoid interviews whenever the subject matter became more detailed? What exactly were they trying to hide? Neil Armstrong, the first man to supposedly set foot on the moon, has always been a mystery. Unlike what one would expect from someone who accomplished one of the greatest feats in the history of humanity, Armstrong chose to live away from the spotlight, refusing most interviews and avoiding speaking openly about the Apollo 11 mission. What little he said over the years always seemed rehearsed, as if he were following a playbook of what he could or could not reveal. In rare public appearances, his speech was extremely generic, without technical details or exciting descriptions of the experience. How could someone who experienced something so extraordinary treat this event in such a cold and impersonal way? And if Neil Armstrong was reserved, Buzz Aldrin was even more controversial. Over the years, Aldrin demonstrated extreme impatience whenever he was faced with questions about the mission. On one famous occasion, an investigative journalist named Bart Sibrel asked Aldrin to swear on the Bible that he had actually been to the moon. What should have been a simple confirmation turned into an embarrassing moment. Aldrin not only refused the request, but also reacted extremely aggressively, even punching the journalist in the face. Now stop and think, if he really was on the moon, why did the mere idea of swearing about it make him so furious? Why didn't he take the oath without hesitation? For someone who had actually been to the moon, this would be a trivial matter. But Aldrin acted as if he had been put against the wall, and it doesn't stop there. In another interview, Buzz Aldrin made an intriguing statement while talking to a child about the Apollo 11 mission. When the girl asked why no one else went to the moon after them, Aldrin's response was disconcerting. Because we never went. A slip-up, an accidental confession, or a moment of sincerity that got out of hand. This episode went viral, and many believe it was a clue that Aldrin, like Armstrong, carries a weight that he could never reveal publicly. In addition to these cases, there are reports that NASA astronauts were instructed not to speak openly about certain details of the missions. Many former space agency employees say there is strict control over what astronauts can say to the public. Documents indicate that participants in the Apollo program underwent extensive media training before press conferences, being instructed to avoid more technical questions or any subject that could raise doubts about the authenticity of the mission. This would explain why, in several interviews, Armstrong and Aldrin seemed hesitant, nervous, and even uncomfortable when faced with unexpected questions. And there is another point that few mention: the number of astronauts and scientists linked to the Apollo program who died under suspicious circumstances. Coincidence or elimination of possible leakers? What we know is that silence about certain aspects of the Apollo missions was strictly imposed, and any attempt at questioning within NASA itself was immediately disregarded or repressed. If everything happened exactly as the agency claims, why so much secrecy? Now I want to know what you think about all this. Do you believe that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin really walked on the moon? Or do you think their behavior indicates that there is something much bigger behind this story? Write your opinion about this mystery in the comments and comment right now. Silence speaks more than 1,000 words. There are many inconsistencies, evidence disappears, and the astronauts themselves seem to avoid the subject. Something about this story doesn't make sense, and anyone who paid attention to the details noticed that. If NASA really put a man on the moon, why does so much evidence point to the opposite? What would happen if this truth came to light? Why do we never go back? Even with all the technology available today, these are uncomfortable questions, and perhaps that is exactly why this mystery continues to be hushed up. And there is an even more frightening detail. If a deception of this magnitude has been sustained for so long, what else could be being hidden from us? This would be the trigger for the population to start questioning the entire information control structure. What do we really know about life beyond Earth? What do we really know about the real nature of our planet? What else could be being manufactured to keep the public within a narrative convenient for elites and governments? The revelation of the Apollo 11 hoax could be just the tip of the iceberg, the beginning of an avalanche of distrust and revelations that would call into question everything we thought we knew about the world. If you agree that more people need to question this story, press like now. This isn't just a click, it's a way to spread this content and ensure that more people start to see the facts. And don't stop here. The next video is already appearing on the screen, and in it we will further explore the secrets that NASA doesn't want you to know. Click now to continue this investigation, and if you want to follow each new revelation, subscribe and turn on notifications. What comes next will leave you even more intrigued.